Welcome, everyone, to this first Ask a Researcher session by the Center for Victim Research. We have wanted to do this kind of thing for some time, and we are so thrilled to have as our first researcher, Dr. Jillian Turanovic. Jillian does just such terrific work on the topic of school violence and victimization, and we know you're really going to like hearing from her. Thank you to all of you folks who sent in questions in advance. We will go through the questions we received in advance, and then in the meantime, if you think of additional questions, go ahead and put them in chat, and we will get to those. Now remember, Jillian or Dr. Turanovic is but one researcher, right? So it's likely that you all might ask something that she doesn't actually know or that she's not comfortable verifying before she speaks it out loud. So if that happens, we will, let you know. She's free to take a pass. We can also send out information after this session if anything comes up that's really compelling and that we would like an additional question. We would like to share additional information. Remember that after the end of this session, there will be a short feedback form that we'll send all of you. That is really important for us for our grant reporting and for planning future events. So please do plan to take that. And now let me introduce Dr. Jillian Turanovic. She's an associate professor in the Department of Sociology and a fellow in the Prevention Science program at the University of Colorado Boulder. She recently switched universities, so that's why I stumbled a little bit. Her research focuses on the causes and consequences of youth victimization, including school violence. She's the author of Thinking About Victimization, Context and Consequences, Confronting School Violence, a synthesis of 6 decades of research, and Revitalizing Victimization Theory, Revisions, Applications, and New Directions. So we knew that she would be the perfect guest for this inaugural issue of Ask a Researcher. Jillian, is there anything you want to say before we get started?
No, this is great. Just thank you all for attending, and I'm happy to be here.
All right. Jason, is there something we want to tell people about where they can see the captions? I know we have a captioner with us. Is that just to make sure that those folks who need the captions, if you look under More with the 3 dots, you'll see Language and Speech, and you should have the ability to see the captions there. If anyone is having trouble, please drop a note in chat and we will take care of it. All right. Okay, well, first question then. And again, thanks for everyone who sent your questions in advance. What prevention tactics have been proven to work best, whether that relates to peer learning or teacher coaching or what?
Okay, so in thinking about what prevention efforts work best, I think it's also important to recognize what kind of the biggest risk markers for victimization are at school. And so given that things like antisocial behavior, peer rejection, and social competence, which have to do with youth's effectiveness in social interactions, are strong correlates of victimization, interventions should therefore incorporate facets of emotional control, conflict management, stress coping, and social skills training.
Okay.
And the best prevention programs are those that are multifaceted and that they don't just focus on youth, but they also involve peers and teachers and kind of a more holistic setting to try and improve not just individuals and their coping behaviors, but also peer groups, classrooms, and the broader school environment. So some examples of these kinds of programs are like the Steps to Respect program. This really focuses on peers, again, classrooms and teacher behaviors, really about building friendship skills, increasing positive and protective social connections, instilling appropriate bystander responses to bullying and peer victimization. And then there's teacher and staff trainings included in that too, about how to kind of effectively monitor and intervene in situations that they see in the classroom and at school. So that's Steps to Respect. The Families in Schools Together, which is called the Fast Track program, is similar, as is the Coping Skills and Paths program, which is promoting alternative thinking strategies. The Coping Power program that's integrated with that. Again, this is multi-level kind of forms of programs and interventions that are really designed to improve peer dynamics, social interactions, and monitoring and behaviors in classrooms.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, that the better programs look at things holistically and don't put all the responsibility on one segment of the issue or the community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So now that I've just said, or we both said holistic, the next question, what are the minimum facilities a school is required to provide to prevent student victimization?
Yeah, and I mean, I think it depends on what's meant by facilities, but I think, at the bare minimum, we need to have systems of reporting for victimization, some form of anti-bullying or anti-victimization kind of curricula that's incorporated into existing student training programs. But in terms of kind of facilities and infrastructure, I think when we want to think about victimization prevention or violence prevention, we have to think that just like we invest in putting money towards other aspects of the school environment, we also need to invest in, violence prevention that is holistic and that supports youth throughout their journeys in school. And sometimes some of those kinds of facilities or infrastructure extends into the community as well. So there's overlap between risky kind of exposure to violence and trauma in the community and how that bleeds into the school environment. But at the bare minimum, I think just having, of course, systems of reporting in place and some type of prevention curricula that's really incorporated into existing school training programs, which I think most schools have. What else were you thinking in terms of like facilities?
Yeah.
So if there's a questioner out there with more to add about the facilities, go ahead and drop that in chat, and we will be watching for that.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, let's go on a little bit. So again, this relates to prevention, but also I guess it can lead into response. How do we get the children to open up to us about their school issues? And then what can we do to help?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a really good and a really important question, because it's really difficult to address victimization if we don't know that it's going on. So I guess the biggest thing, and this is easier said than done, but is to foster kind of a safe and supportive learning environment in a way that increases disclosure and help seeking. So this has a lot to do with school climate, building relational trust with students. There's curricula that's based on this idea of building kind of a more inclusive learning environment, and it involves activities where students, feel comfortable asking questions, they're sharing their thoughts. That's really step one. But I think another really important component is being aware of how to provide trauma-informed responses to students who do disclose or who maybe seem to be in need or facing problems at school. I think like a really delicate balance that we all try to strike is to determining when a student may be struggling with issues and is therefore, behaving or engaging in ways in the classroom that seem problematic, when to meet those kind of displays of behavior with discipline versus support or help. I think for kids who are struggling in the aftermath of trauma and victimization, their coping responses may manifest in school misbehaviors or problems in the classroom, and meeting those with disciplinary actions can decrease help seeking and can sometimes kind of compound their reactions. So I recommend looking into some resources on fostering safe and supportive learning environments and educating school faculty and staff on trauma and trauma-informed responses to students. There's really great sources of information out there on how to provide kind of trauma-informed school settings and learning environments, and I think that's a great place to start.
Great, thank you. That's a great thought for us to be thinking about, incorporating just a basic trauma-informed response, because this is something that school personnel are going to come up against all the time, that a student may disclose, and being prepared. This is related, and you touched, a little bit on it, about how do you identify the signs of victimization in students, and how then do you link them to treatment and services?
Yeah, this is another great question. So youth who've been traumatized or exposed to victimization tend to have trouble paying attention, maintaining safe and positive relationships, and tend to have difficulty regulating their emotions. So they may appear aggressive and defensive, or alternatively really withdrawn or disconnected. And so recognizing changes in these kinds of behaviors, so withdrawn behavior, social isolation, acting out, not completing assignments, school absences, or avoiding school activities, things like that are things to watch out for. But without, again, considering that these things may be manifestations of trauma, we do run the risk of misunderstanding and mislabeling the core issues that these students may be facing. So it's really common for students exposed to trauma and victimization to be kind of mislabeled as resistant, unmotivated, disrespectful, or attention seeking, or just, problem kids in the classroom. But all of these behaviors and signs may have roots in trauma. And so engaging in students with conversations about what may be going on with their lives is really important. And also providing an effective kind of trauma-informed response to these kinds of behaviors, rather than meeting them with only discipline or punishment, can also help, I guess, improve their disclosure, and also your ability to then funnel them to appropriate treatment services as well.
Do you have any suggestions for the kinds of treatment or services that schools should have in place, or have identified in the community?
Yeah, I think it varies so much, and it really depends on the age of kids as well, and how much parents need to be involved in that process. But at the very least, I think having a school counselor or someone available to talk through students with problems that they may be experiencing, and then being able, again, to kind of connect them to support services in the community. And a lot of that may be therapy and kind of counseling. And but it's really up to the schools to kind of decide when to recommend something, or loop in parents to that discussion, to get students into those external kind of counseling and support services as well, which, for many families also come at a cost that can also be problematic for more disadvantaged families that are struggling financially. But at the very least, I think having a counselor at school, or a trusted mentor or adult that students can feel comfortable opening up to, can be huge.
Yeah, thanks. Folks, if any of this has sparked additional questions, go ahead and put them in the chat. But now let's move on to a couple of questions about data that we received. First, what are the findings regarding how many school shooters kill a family member or an intimate partner prior to their violence occurring at the targeted school? Is there a connection there in the data?
Well, okay, so school shootings generally, so most school shootings don't involve any fatalities, right? The majority of shootings that happen on a yearly basis are guns going off at school, or guns being brandished at school, and sometimes those are captured as school shootings.
Okay.
But in terms of deadly incidents of school shootings, just like mass shootings generally, deadly mass shootings, there's no one distinct profile. But what we do know is that a lot of these problems originate in bullying and trauma within the home. And especially in the case of mass shootings, there's typically issues of bullying and domestic violence, or exposure to family violence, that plays a role in the shooter's past. And so, again, with respect to kind of preventing school violence, there's things that can be targeted in the school environment, but then there's also a lot that originates in the home and the community that we need to do a better job at preventing as well. So I don't give you the exact number, but
right.
Yes, there's overlap.
So a follow-on question, and I know that this didn't come in advance, so it's springing on you a little bit. Is there a great source of data nationwide for incidents of school victimization?
Yeah, so it depends on the type of victimization you're looking at. So we can compile data from a variety of sources. With respect to school shootings, there's a school shooting database that is populated through open source records. So basically media reports, and it's not an official kind of FBI or DOJ related database. We can use the NIVERS data, which is the National Incident-Based Reporting System, to see if a victimization or an incident occurred at school. There's the Youth Risk Behavior Survey data that asks youth to self-report their experiences with victimization at school. That's on high school students, and that's conducted yearly by the CDC. The NCVS has a school supplement for youth 12 or older, but in general, there is no one comprehensive national database on the entire spectrum of school violence or victimization that occurs, which is problematic because when you have different studies using different data, you can get different pictures of the problem.
Right.
Yeah. And so we tend to be better at tracking more serious forms of violence in school. And that means in our official data, those that are actually reported to law enforcement or that come to the attention of juvenile justice systems. But in general, like more minor forms of victimization and bullying, which we know still have a lot of consequences for youth and for school environments, are going to be underrepresented in those kinds of data. So, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm glad you just mentioned the difference between the reported cases, many of which are the more serious cases, and then the underreported, because the next question is, why are so many cases of school victimization not being reported?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I think this also varies depending on the age of youth, right? And their fear of consequences of what it means to report. So especially in middle school and high school youth, for forms of victimization that may be peer-based, right, and rooted in these social hierarchies, I think there's a lot of fear of retaliation for what it means if I do report, this person gets in trouble, my life is going to be more difficult, fear of not being believed. And I think fear of just the general consequences of what that might mean. Maybe it's not a worry that it's not going to be confidential. And I think when there's gender dynamics too, like we see issues of underreporting really substantial for forms of sexual victimization that occur at school and forms of sexual harassment, and the kind of dating violence, especially that occurs among more high school aged youth. Yeah, I think not wanting to relive, retell, not be believed, and then fearful of the consequences socially and for them long term of what happens if they do report. Yeah.
So you mentioned a high school study where youth are reporting on their own, and maybe that's part of the answer to this next question, which is how can we get an idea on statewide numbers if it's not reported? And
Right.
and is there also a difficulty in getting reported numbers because of those causing the harm and receiving the harm being underage?
Yeah, so in terms of, statewide numbers, a lot of my research has focused on victimization in schools within Florida. And so the State Department of Education does release information on reported or, verified incidents of victimization or violence that have happened at school. But there's a lot of inconsistencies in reporting across categories. And there's underreports of, bullying, relational aggression, of course, and a lot of kind of the State Department of Education data or even juvenile justice data is, again, only those cases that are, again, reported and reach some kind of stage of verification. Whereas we know there's a larger dark figure of victimization that's occurring that is maybe less to do with being underage and more to do with just being not officially reported, or officially documented for a variety of reasons. And so it is really difficult to get a full scope of the picture with just one form of data. And so, in some of my research, we try and rely on officially reported data and then combine that with survey data to try and fill in the gaps and get a fuller picture of victimization. But most of that self-report data on the state level is, again, being captured not among younger students, but among high school students.
Right. As you, as a researcher, look at the issue of bullying, victimization, have the reasons that kids are being bullied changed over time, or has the nature of bullying changed over time?
Okay, this is a really good question. So, bullying research started a long time ago. So we have research dating back to the 1960s trying to understand sources of bullying in schools, bullying victimization. And I think the general themes are consistent still today, where kids who are most at risk for bullying are those who are kind of stigmatized and labeled as social misfits, or they're different in some way. They have some identifying characteristic that departs from the homogeneous norm of whatever the broader peer group is at school. So that could be race, that could be disability status, that could be, their socioeconomic background that stands out as different from the rest, any kind of physical or feature or marker or trait that marks them as different and then stigmatized, puts at risk for bullying. So I think kind of the markers of being different, that's always been a common theme. But of course, I think what's changed over time, generationally, is the use of technology and social media in facilitating bullying behaviors. So you think for youth who experience bullying at school, leaving the school grounds, I think at some point used to be a reprieve from that. So they go home, that's a different environment. Whereas now, because of how connected kids are to technology and the way that they use social media to communicate, and oftentimes that's for positive, social networking reasons, that provides avenues for the bullying and harassment to continue off of school grounds as well. And so I think there's less of a chance for students to get that kind of reprieve from bullying given their access to social media. And it comes in different forms in terms of incessant harassment, trolling online, posting like defamation about youth and spreading rumors. So I think the modes for bullying to continue have definitely advanced, even if the reasons for why it's happening haven't changed a lot.
Okay. One of the things that you mentioned about kids being different was socioeconomic backgrounds. And we did get a question, how do socioeconomic disparities impact school victimization, if they do?
Yeah, this is a great question. So when we look at victimization at the school level, so looking at schools that have more victimization than other schools that are concentrated in communities that have more disadvantage tend to have higher rates of violence and victimization generally. But on the individual level, disadvantaged backgrounds can play a more nuanced role. So in the large meta-analysis that I led on all of the major predictors of school victimization throughout the literature, socioeconomic status really wasn't a major risk factor on its own. And the research tends to suggest that it operates in more nuanced ways where, again, if you are from a more socioeconomic disadvantaged backgrounds, and that is different from the rest of the youth that you go to school with, then that becomes a risk marker for victimization. So if you're standing out as vulnerable or different, that can come with that kind of social stigma. But I think disadvantage generally and socioeconomic disparities matter because the other major risk factors for victimization being prior victimization, antisocial behavior, exposure to disadvantaged community or home life, those factors are also more concentrated in more disadvantaged communities. And so you don't want to dismiss it as not a strong risk factor or a strong driver of school victimization, because it sets the context for those other risk factors to develop.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
You've been talking. If you need to get a drink of water, please do. You're doing
Oh, yeah,
great,
no,
but
I'm
I'm
good.
just having you talk.
Yeah,
Yeah,
sorry.
the next question it's. I think the next question might be have a long answer too, and that is, how has research on school victimization changed before versus during and after the pandemic? So, because that really disrupted school life and kids' connections to school. So, and this questioner was really interested in both looking at or finding things to think about as a researcher, and also any interesting indicators that are different in the data. It's a
Yeah,
very
this is a
complex question, but I'm really eager to hear your response.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of work that's trying to identify basically the impact of COVID on various outcomes. And so we know that, the onset of the COVID pandemic resulted in a lot of negative outcomes for youth. So we see increased loneliness, feelings of social isolation, more struggles with depression and anxiety. And then for a lot of youth, especially in disadvantaged communities that were affected by COVID, seeing, exposure to more trauma, illness, violence increased in a number of communities, during the COVID pandemic and after, George Floyd and things like that, that are traumatic. Right. And so I think what's really important now is recognizing that kids are bringing with them to the school environment these complex experiences with trauma and vulnerability factors that are probably going to impact school climate in a number of ways. And when we think about victimization and students and their experiences, we can't also ignore teachers, right? And the school climate overall and their own struggles with what that meant to live through the pandemic and teach online, which is also really stressful. So I think more so than ever, people are coming to the classroom with complex traumas. And then we're still dealing with kind of the aftermath of a lot of those mental health and social consequences that affected youth during a really critical time of their development. I do think, though, that a lot of the research hasn't quite caught up to identifying these complex factors, and I'm really curious to see kind of in the years to come what changes we see in terms of school victimization and violence and kind of the consequences of that. I will say that the data show that violence and victimization have gone down in schools.
Okay.
And, not just during that COVID year where everyone was online, but even continuing after. So I think there's a lot to explore. That's not a clear answer, but just, things to think about. And I think it's a great thing to think about of how our world maybe looks different today. And especially for kids, depending on the age in which they live through COVID, what their school experience looks like.
Right. Because of course it's likely to differ depending on where they were in their development when COVID struck.
Yeah.
Let's turn to Title IX because we got a couple of questions about that. What do you see as the intersection with Title IX and how Title IX processes might impact victimization?
Yeah, so this is an area that I'm less familiar with at, the kind of K-12 level. More so I'm familiar with the processing of kind of sexual assault and harassment cases at the university level, given that there's been policy changes to Title IX under the Trump administration, and then now there's discussions about, a lot of those changes kind of being reversed under Biden. So, in generally, Title IX is important in, guaranteeing that schools have a responsibility to kind of promptly and effectively respond to known instances of sexual harassment and sexual violence. And they're upheld to the standard if there's a hostile environment that's facilitating sexual harassment, that they need to address it. And so, but I think with Title IX, recognizing that even if a student or a student's parent doesn't want to file a complaint or doesn't want to take any action on the student's behalf, the school still has a responsibility to know about the sexual harassment or violence that's occurring and investigate and take appropriate steps to resolve that situation. And that's separate from criminal investigations. But I think the most important thing about Title IX, not maybe how it impacts victimization, but how it impacts victims' awareness of what the steps are. Title IX is great at, requiring that schools publicize at least a process and steps for what happens if something is reported, so that students know their rights. But I'm happy if anyone else has any kind of important things to chime in with respect to Title IX and their experiences in their schools with Title IX issues.
Great. So folks, feel free to use that chat. And also, if anyone out there is aware of resources regarding Title IX or already sees a gap in Title IX resources for at below the college and university level. So while we're on the topic of federal law, got another question. Is there a federal anti-bullying act, or are there federal laws that you're aware of that relate to bullying?
Yeah, so in terms of what I'm aware of, there's no federal law that specifically applies to bullying. And correct me if I'm wrong, but in some cases, I think when bullying is based on race or ethnicity, national origin, sex, disability, or religion, that bullying then overlaps with where there is federal legislation about protected statuses, especially if that's interfering with students' rights to achieve and have access to, a fair and equitable education. But there are usually so there's federal laws that offer protections that can benefit kids who may be at risk for bullying if they have learning disabilities, things like that. But all states have anti-bullying laws. And so at the state level is where you will see that's where the strongest protections for bullying are. And so they vary from state to state. And you can look up your state's anti-bullying law. There's a website, Stop Bullying, or your state's Department of Education will usually advertise what that is. But a typical state anti-bullying law will require a school to report, document, and investigate bullying within a certain number of days. And it requires the school to take action to stop it. And some states have processes in place for offering services like counseling to the victim and the bully. But again, these laws vary a lot on a state level.
Yeah, thank you. And I understand. So you've still got the federal civil rights protections and anti-hate crime things.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Here's another big one that I think is a great close to the questions we've received in advance. And that is, how can we start the shift from a punishment view to a restorative view? So how do we engage teachers and students in anti-oppression talk and work that can reduce school victimization?
I mean, this is such an excellent question, and I don't have a clear answer to this, but what I will say is, especially as a researcher who studies victimization and violence, I see such a tension and disconnect between those efforts at prevention in terms of holistic, peer-based, family-oriented prevention efforts to stop violence that are trying to occur alongside often more punitive, punishment-based, legislative mandates to target hardened schools, increase metal detectors, the use of clear backpacks, having in some states armed guardians, in addition to the increased police presence in school. I think it's challenging to build a more holistic and inclusive school climate when there's policies that are very popular and being implemented at schools nationwide that are meant to make the school environment in ways seem less inclusive and more hostile, right? where students are being increasingly monitored and supervised because the threat of school gun violence is driving a lot of those initiatives. And so I think there's a tension there in terms of the policy responses that we put in place. And oftentimes, those kinds of peer-based holistic school climate type of interventions are contrasting with, those more punishment oriented and target hardening school security type of measures that again can make the school environment just seem again less inclusive and less welcoming and less supportive. So yeah, it's a challenge. But I mean, this is a great thing. And I mean, education is power, right? Recognizing, disparities in terms of race, sexual orientation. I mean, we know that youth who are of color in white schools, youth of immigrant backgrounds, youth who identify as LGBT or who may be struggling with learning or physical disability issues, these are, markers for victimization. And so anything that we can do to kind of increase inclusiveness, awareness, and empathy for people who look different, I think can be really helpful and is a step.
That's great. Thank you. We got another question. Is there a state, back when you were talking about the differences in state laws, is there a state that you believe has model policies or model laws? And if you don't want to say this one is better than all 50 for sure, are there some that stand out in your mind as being strong?
I know what did stand out to me, and this can, be some fault, but I know like with Oregon, they implemented some pretty innovative policies for bullying where it was required that, again, that students received some type of support services or counseling to victims and bullies should it come to the attention of school authorities. And double check that, but I'm pretty sure that Oregon had some pretty innovative and progressive policies with respect to school bullying that were not just about providing punishment to the perpetrator, but also support and kind of a more holistic kind of restorative response to bullying. So I would check them out.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
We got another thought shared. I'll see if you have any reaction to this. It seems to me that we need to, and this is from Anna, it seems to me that we need to incorporate social emotional learning skills into each class and have teachers understand how to support children when challenges arise instead of being so punitive. Also, kids have barely any time to socialize at school, so teachers are unaware or unable to interfere. And many times teachers don't interfere because of their fear or concern of backlash from parents.
Yeah.
Anna points to Mountain View Middle School, which has restorative practices in their school in Washington State.
Wonderful. Yeah. Social emotional learning is a huge component of a lot of those kinds of effective prevention programs for school violence and victimization that were mentioned. So yeah, I think that's wonderful.
And then Tara is asking, do you have any suggestions for research articles regarding teachers' feelings around school climate? She's curious about whether teachers are possibly experiencing vicarious trauma due to a stressful work environment and trying to juggle their duty to educate and meet test score criteria with providing social and emotional support for their students.
Absolutely. I can share after this a few resources, if that would be great. Susan,
sure.
If you think that's a good idea.
Yeah, we'd be happy to include those resources when we send everyone a link to this recording.
Okay, awesome. But yeah, I mean, I think that's the problem is teachers are so strapped. They have a million responsibilities and there's only so much time and energy they have in their day to not only get through their requirements for testing, what have you, and then also then be expected to develop and implement these different interventions and trainings. It's a lot. And so we see a lot of burnout. We see vicarious trauma and victimization among teachers, especially those who've witnessed and exposed to violence at school or been the target of violence as well. And we focus a lot on victimization that happens against youth, but less so on what to do when it's against a teacher. But there has been some research on that, and so I'm happy to share some of that.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
While we wait to see what other questions come in, are you aware of either some research you're just starting now, or your colleagues' research that you're excited about and can't wait to see the results?
Yeah, I think what I'm working on right now is a statewide study of school violence in Florida, so less so on the victimization side of things, just given the nature of data, but looking at whether violence that happens in school is unique in its sources and context than violence that happens in the community as perpetrated by youth. And I think it's important to ask this question because we do have a lot of violence prevention efforts that are targeted to community violence, and then we have a lot of school-specific interventions that are directed towards school victimization, and we're unsure if it's the same youth that we're targeting in both contexts or not. And so I think it's really important to understand the ways in which school violence is unique from violence in the community, and the ways in which school violence represents just an extension of violence that happens in the community as well. Trying to de-silo those systems to, again, provide more effective kind of intervention from community violence and school violence.
Yeah, that does sound exciting, because I'm sure that, once we know more about that, then the avenues to target victimization through the schools will become much more clear.
Yeah.
Folks, I have dropped the link to the feedback form in the chat, so please go ahead and click on it now, or make sure that you click on it before you leave, because we are going to want your feedback, and there will also be a place for you to request a certificate of attendance or to post additional questions. We are almost at time. We have just a couple more minutes scheduled. Is there anything else that you'd like to share with us, or to get us thinking about with the collection of data, or what issues we should all have our radars up?
Yeah, I think for me, the biggest thing and really getting into this work is to recognizing that, especially victimization, it's not an individual only problem, and to really be inclusive of and cognizant of peer contexts, social contexts, and how community and family risk factors kind of translate into the school environment. So thinking about broader, again, social dynamics, peer dynamics, and cultural dynamics at school that set the stage for youth to be at risk or vulnerable to being targeted, I think is important. We can't just look at an individual and their own risk factors. We have to look at the contexts that are also driving and generating these risky contexts in the first place, right? What makes LGBTQ youth more likely to be targeted at some schools than others? What are the factors that are driving that? Things like that, I think, are really important. We can't just look at youth and their own kind of risk factors and behaviors. We have to look more to a broader context. I think that's my biggest message in doing this work. Because I think we don't want to treat youth as problematic or at risk or blame them for their experiences. We have to look into those broader social contexts and settings.
Well, I want to thank you for your time, for all this information, and for doing this work. I think that we are all glad that you are out there leading the charge, or really one of the driving forces behind this research, because it's so important for our kids to feel safe in schools so that they can thrive as adults.
Thank you so much.
So folks, again, please take that feedback survey and feel free to post some additional questions in that form, and we will be sharing some resources with the link to the recording. So with that, thanks so much. Have a good day, everyone. Thanks for joining.